Elara stood at the edge of the ceremony grounds, her fingers twisted in the soft fabric of her cloak. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and pine. Around her, the pack gathered in a wide circle, their voices rising in a chant she had once imagined would be for her. She pressed one hand against her stomach, a gesture so small no one would notice. Beneath her ribs, a secret pulsed with quiet certainty. 3 weeks had passed since she'd first felt the change. 3 weeks since the nausea began, since her senses sharpened, since the dreams started. The dreams were always the same. A child with silver eyes. A throne carved from ancient stone. A voice that whispered in a language she did not recognize, but somehow understood. Kale stood at the center of the clearing, his shoulders broad beneath the ceremonial cloak. The firelight painted him in shades of gold and amber. He looked every bit the alpha he was born to be, strong, steady, untouchable. Beside him stood Seraphine. Elara's breath caught, and she forced herself to look away. She had known this moment was coming. She had prepared for it, steeling herself each night as she lay alone in her small room at the edge of the pack house. But knowing and witnessing were not the same. The elder raised the Luna crown, its silver band gleaming in the firelight. The chanting grew louder. Elara's heart beat in time with the rhythm, a drum she could not silence. Kale's hands moved with careful reverence as he took the crown from the elder. His gaze stayed fixed on Seraphine, and Elara saw no hesitation in his expression, no doubt, no shadow of regret. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the crown rested on Seraphine's dark hair. The pack erupted in celebration, voices rising to the sky. Drums began to beat. Wolves howled in unison, their song carrying through the forest. Elara did not howl with them. She turned and slipped through the crowd, moving carefully so no one would follow. Her legs felt unsteady, but she kept walking. Past the bonfire, past the tables laden with food and drink, past the laughter and joy that belonged to everyone but her. The forest welcomed her with cool shadows and the rustle of leaves. She walked until the noise faded, until the only sound was her own breathing and the quiet whisper of wind through the branches. She sank onto a fallen log and let the tears come. It had been 2 months since Kale stopped meeting her eyes, 2 months since he began finding reasons to leave a room when she entered, 2 months since the warmth between them turned to ice, and she did not know why. Before that, there had been a night she would carry with her always. The memory rose unbidden, as it so often did. The summer night when the pack had celebrated the longest day. She and Kale had stolen away from the festivities, walking the forest paths they had known since childhood. He had taken her hand. She had leaned into his warmth. They had found a clearing where moonlight spilled, like water over soft grass. He had kissed her there, slow and tender, as though she were something precious. And she had believed, in that moment, that she was. What followed was gentle, careful, full of whispered words and shared breath. He had held her afterward, his arms strong and certain around her, and she had felt safer than she ever had in her life. She had thought it meant something. She had thought it meant everything. But when dawn came, something shifted. He grew distant. Polite. His smiles no longer reached his eyes when he looked at her. And when Seraphine arrived from the northern pack a week later, Kale's attention turned to her entirely. Elara wiped her eyes and drew a shaky breath. She could not undo the past. She could not make him love her. And she would not beg. Her hand moved to her stomach again, resting there with quiet resolve. Whatever Kale had chosen, whatever future he was building with Seraphine, it no longer included her. But this child, this life growing inside her, that was hers. She thought of her grandmother then, the woman who had raised her after her parents died, the woman who had told her stories of their bloodline, stories Elara had always believed were simply myths meant to comfort a lonely child. But 3 nights ago, while packing her few belongings, Elara had found a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her grandmother's old room. The leather was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and inside, written in her grandmother's careful hand, was the truth. Their bloodline was not ordinary. It carried a power that had slept for generations, waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right child. A child conceived under a summer moon by a Luna-born daughter and an alpha of the old blood. Elara's hands had trembled as she read. Her grandmother had written of visions, of a prophecy passed down through the women of their family, a child who would carry the power to reshape the pack laws, to end the reign of any alpha who ruled through cruelty or deceit, to bring balance or to bring ruin. Elara had not understood all of it. Some passages were written in the old tongue, and she could only make out fragments. But one thing was clear. The child she carried was more than Kale knew, more than anyone knew. And if the wrong people learned of it, both she and the child would be in danger. She heard footsteps behind her and stiffened. For a wild moment, she thought it might be Kale, that he had noticed her absence and followed, that he would sit beside her and ask what was wrong, the way he used to. But the footsteps passed by, belonging to some other wolf returning to the celebration. Elara let out a breath and stood. Her legs felt steadier now. Her tears had dried. She looked back toward the distant glow of the bonfire. The sounds of celebration still carried on the wind. Somewhere in that crowd, Kale stood beside his new Luna. Somewhere in that crowd, her place had been erased. She turned and walked deeper into the forest, letting the darkness fold around her like a cloak. She did not know yet what she would do. She did not know where she would go or how she would protect the life growing inside her. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not stay and watch herself be forgotten. The trees around her seemed to hum with a low, steady energy. She felt it in her bones, in the rhythm of her heartbeat. The forest had always been her refuge, even as a child. Her grandmother used to say the land remembered their family, that the old magic in their blood recognized the old magic in the earth. Elara had thought it was poetry, a way to make a lonely girl feel special. Now she wondered if it had been truth all along. She paused at the forest's edge, where the packlands met the wild border. Beyond lay territory that belonged to no one. Dangerous, some said. Unpredictable, but also free. She stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting on her stomach. The child inside her was barely more than a whisper of life. But already, she felt its presence. Already, she knew she would do anything to keep it safe, even if it meant leaving behind the only home she had ever known. Even if it meant walking away from the man she had loved with her whole heart. She took one last look at the distant firelight. Then she turned and walked back toward the pack house, her steps quiet and sure. She had plans to make, preparations to complete, and a future to protect. Elara woke before dawn to the sound of rain against her window. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm. Her hand found its way to her stomach again, a gesture that was already becoming habit. The nausea had eased during the night, but the exhaustion remained, settling into her bones like fog. She rose slowly and dressed in simple clothes. The pack house was quiet around her. Most wolves would sleep late after the celebration. She was grateful for the solitude. She slipped out through the kitchen entrance, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the damp morning air. The rain had softened to a mist. She walked with purpose, her feet carrying her along a path she knew by heart. The path led away from the main territory, toward the old section of forest, where few wolves ventured anymore. Her grandmother's cottage stood there, abandoned for nearly 3 years now. Elara had not been able to bring herself to clear it out. She had visited occasionally, sitting in the dusty silence and remembering. Today, she had a different purpose. The cottage appeared through the trees, its roof sagging slightly, its windows dark. Elara pushed open the door. It creaked on old hinges. Inside, everything was as she remembered. The herbs still hung in bunches from the rafters, dried and brittle now. The books still lined the shelves, their spines faded. The rocking chair still sat by the cold hearth. Elara moved through the space slowly, touching familiar objects. Her grandmother had been a healer, a woman of quiet strength and deep knowledge. The pack had respected her, even feared her a little. She had died peacefully in her sleep, leaving Elara with only memories, and this cottage full of remnants. She had also left something else. Elara knelt by the hearth and ran her fingers along the stones. Her grandmother had shown her once, years ago, when Elara was still a child, a hidden space behind the third stone from the left, a place for things that needed to be kept safe. She pressed the stone and felt it shift. It slid back with a soft scrape. Behind it lay a small hollow carved into the wall. Inside was a leather-bound journal, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. Elara drew it out carefully. Her heart beat faster. She had not looked at this in years. She had almost forgotten it existed. She unwrapped the journal and opened it. The pages were yellowed but intact. Her grandmother's handwriting covered them, neat and precise. Elara sat back on her heels and began to read. The first entries were simple. Records of births and deaths, notes on herbal remedies, weather patterns, and moon cycles. But as Elara turned the pages, the content shifted. Her grandmother's tone became more personal, more urgent. There were passages about the family bloodline, about gifts that passed from mother to daughter, skipping some generations but always returning, about power that slept until it was needed. Elara's hands trembled slightly as she read. Her grandmother wrote about a prophecy, an old story passed down through their line. It spoke of a child who would be born during a time of division, a child whose blood carried the strength of the old world and the new, a child who could unite what had been broken or destroy what had been built. The prophecy was vague in the way of all old stories, but certain details were specific. The child would be conceived under a full moon. The mother would be cast aside by the father. The birth would come at a time of great change. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She and Kale had been together on the night of the last full moon. She remembered it clearly. He had been tender with her, holding her close afterward, his hand resting over her heart. He had whispered that he loved her, that she was his. 2 weeks later, he had withdrawn. His warmth had turned to coldness. He had avoided her eyes in public and offered no explanation. And then, without warning, he had announced his intention to crown Seraphine as his Luna. Elara closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. The pieces were falling into place. The prophecy, the timing, the sudden shift in Kale's behavior. She read further. Her grandmother had written about the gifts that came with carrying such a child. Heightened intuition, increased strength, a connection to the old magic that lived in the earth and the trees. The mother would begin to feel it as the pregnancy progressed, a hum beneath her skin, a warmth in her chest, a knowing. Elara thought of the way the forest had felt last night, the energy she had sensed in the trees, the way her heartbeat had seemed to sync with something larger than herself. She turned another page. Her grandmother had written a warning. The child's power would make it a target. There were those who would seek to control it. those who would see it as a threat. The mother must be careful, must protect the child at all costs, must trust her instincts above all else. Elara sat in the dim cottage, the journal open on her lap, and let the weight of it settle over her. She had not imagined the danger. It was real. It was written in her grandmother's hand, confirmed by generations of women who had carried this knowledge in secret. And Kale had crowned another woman as Luna, not knowing what he had set in motion. She wondered if someone else knew, if that was why he had been pushed to make the choice he did. Seraphine had appeared suddenly, arriving from a distant pack with offers of alliance. She had been beautiful and confident, claiming ties to powerful families. Kale had seemed almost compelled to accept her. Elara had not understood it then. She had thought he simply no longer wanted her. Now, she wondered if there had been manipulation, if someone had whispered the right words into his ear, if the choice had not been entirely his own. But it did not matter now. The damage was done. She closed the journal and wrapped it carefully again. She would take it with her. It held answers she would need, guidance her grandmother had intended for her. She rose and looked around the cottage one last time. This place had been a haven once, a space filled with love and learning. Now it was just an echo of the past. She tucked the journal under her arm and left, closing the door softly behind her. The mist had cleared as she walked back toward the pack house. The sun was rising, casting pale light through the trees. She felt calmer now, more grounded. The fear had not left her, but it had settled into something manageable. She had a plan forming in her mind, a direction. She would need to move carefully. She could not let anyone suspect what she carried. Not yet. Not until she was far from here. Her great-aunt Liana lived in the mountains, in neutral territory beyond the reach of any single pack. Elara had met her only a few times as a child, but she remembered her as kind and wise. A woman who lived quietly and asked few questions. That was where she would go. That was where she would be safe. She reached the edge of the pack house grounds and paused. In the distance, she could see wolves beginning to stir. The day was beginning. Life was moving forward, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. For her. For the child she carried. For the future that now rested in her hands. She took a breath and stepped forward. The journal pressed close against her side, and the certainty of her path clear in her heart. The gathering hall buzzed with voices and laughter, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and honeyed wine. Elara stood near the far wall, her hands clasped before her, her expression carefully neutral. She had tried to avoid coming tonight, but attendance was not optional. The new Luna had made that clear. Seraphine sat beside Kale at the head table, radiant in a gown of deep crimson that caught the firelight. She smiled easily, touching Kale's arm as she spoke to those gathered near. He nodded politely, his expression difficult to read. Elara looked away before their eyes could meet. She had dressed simply, a plain tunic and skirt that drew no attention. She kept to the edges of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed until the evening ended. But hope was a fragile thing. Elara. The voice cut through the noise, clear and commanding. Seraphine's voice. The hall quieted gradually as heads turned. Elara's stomach tightened, but she lifted her chin and met the Luna's gaze across the crowded space. Seraphine rose gracefully from her seat, her smile warm but her eyes cold. "Come here, please." There was no mistaking it for a request. Elara walked forward slowly, aware of every eye on her. The distance between the wall and the head table felt endless. She stopped a respectful distance away and inclined her head. "My Luna." Seraphine's smile widened. "I've been told you have experience serving at gatherings. Is that true?" Elara's pulse quickened. She kept her voice steady. I have helped before, yes. Wonderful. Seraphine gestured toward the long table laden with food and drink. We're in need of someone to refill the cups tonight. The servers are overwhelmed. I'm sure you won't mind. The implication was clear. The insult barely veiled. Elara felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her. To refuse would be open defiance. To obey would be public humiliation. She glanced toward Kale without meaning to. He sat very still, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. His silence carved something hollow inside her chest. She looked back at Seraphine and nodded once. Of course. The Luna's expression brightened. How kind of you. Elara turned and walked toward the serving table, feeling the stares follow her. Whispers rose in her wake, soft and eager. She picked up a pitcher of wine, the ceramic cool and heavy in her hands, and moved along the rows of seated guests. She poured without meeting anyone's eyes, her movements careful and deliberate. Some nodded their thanks. Others ignored her entirely. A few smiled with barely concealed amusement. She swallowed the shame and continued, pitcher in hand, moving from table to table like a shadow. When she reached the head table, Seraphine held out her cup with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elara poured slowly, watching the dark wine rise. Seraphine's fingers brushed hers as she took the cup back. Thank you, dear. You're quite good at this. Elara stepped back without answering. Kale's cup sat untouched beside his plate. She hesitated, then reached forward, to fill it. His hand moved slightly, as if to stop her, but he pulled it back. She poured in silence, her heart a stone in her chest. When she finished, she stepped away and returned to the serving table. The evening dragged on. She refilled cups and platters, cleared empty dishes, and kept her face blank. Her feet ached. Her back protested. The early exhaustion of pregnancy weighed on her more than it should have, but she did not let it show. She would not give anyone the satisfaction. Finally, as the fire burned low and the laughter grew louder, Seraphine dismissed her with a wave of her hand. Elara set down the pitcher and left the hall without a word. The night air outside was cold and sharp. She breathed it in deeply, letting it clear the heat from her face. Her hands trembled now that no one was watching. She pressed them flat against her thighs and walked quickly toward the small cottage she still called home. Inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, her eyes burning. She did not cry. She had no tears left for this, only a deep, aching resolve. She moved to the small table and sat down, pulling her grandmother's journal toward her. The candlelight flickered as she opened it again, tracing the familiar handwriting with her fingertips. The words steadied her, reminded her of who she was, what she carried. Seraphine could humiliate her in public. Kale could remain silent. The pack could whisper and judge. None of it mattered. She was leaving. Soon. She thought of Mira, her oldest friend, the only person she trusted completely. She would need help. Supplies. Information about the mountain paths. Mira would not ask too many questions. She would simply help, the way she always had. Elara closed the journal and rose. Tomorrow she would speak to Mira. Tonight, she would rest and let the anger settle into something useful, something that would carry her forward. She changed into her night clothes and lay down on the narrow bed, her hand resting lightly over her stomach. The child inside her was barely more than a flutter of life, but it was enough. Enough to fight for. Enough to protect. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind already mapping the road ahead. The journey would be difficult, dangerous even. But staying here was worse. Staying here meant watching herself become invisible, watching her child grow up in the shadow of a Luna who despised her, and an Alpha who had chosen silence over loyalty. No, she would not let that happen. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, written in careful script on the pages of the journal. Strength does not come from power alone. It comes from knowing when to hold on and when to let go. Elara had held on long enough. Now it was time to let go. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion pull her under. Tomorrow would come soon enough. And when it did, she would take the first step toward the life she needed to build. A life far from here. Far from him. Far from the man who had stood by and let her be reduced to nothing. She did not hate him. Not entirely. But she could not love him anymore. Not like this. Not when his silence hurt more than his absence ever had. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it brought no dreams. Only the quiet dark and the promise of motion. Of choice. Of freedom waiting just beyond the next moon. When morning came, she would find Mira, and together they would begin the plan that would carry her away from this place and into a future she could not yet see clearly, but one she knew, deep in her bones, was hers to claim. Elara waited until mid-morning to find Mira. The pack house was quieter then, most wolves occupied with their daily routines. She slipped through the back corridors and out toward the eastern gardens, where Mira often tended the medicinal herbs. The air was cool and damp from the night's rain. Elara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and followed the stone path between the raised beds. She found Mira kneeling beside a patch of chamomile, her dark hair tied back with a strip of worn linen. Mira looked up and smiled, but the expression faltered when she saw Elara's face. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly, rising to her feet and brushing the soil from her hands. Elara glanced around. The garden was empty, but voices carried easily here. She lowered her voice and stepped closer. "I need to talk to you. Somewhere private." Mira's brow creased with concern, but she nodded without hesitation. She set down her small basket of cuttings and gestured toward the far end of the garden, where a narrow gate led to the forest path. They walked in silence until the trees closed around them and the sounds of the packlands faded. Mira led her to a clearing where a fallen log provided a place to sit. The ground was carpeted with moss and last season's leaves. Mira sat and looked at her expectantly, her hands folded in her lap. "Tell me," she said gently. Elara sat beside her and exhaled slowly. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt fragile and uncertain. "I'm leaving," she said finally. Mira's eyes widened. "Leaving? When?" "Soon, before the next full moon." Mira was quiet for a moment, her gaze searching Elara's face. "Because of her?" Elara nodded. "Because of her, because of him. Because I can't stay here anymore." Mira reached out and took her hand. Her grip was warm and steady. "I understand," she said softly. "But where will you go?" Elara hesitated. This was the part that required trust. Complete trust. She looked at Mira, her oldest friend, the one person who had never judged her or turned away. "My grandmother had a sister," she said slowly. "She lives in the mountains, the neutral territory beyond the northern ridge. I'm going to her." Mira nodded, absorbing the information. "That's a long journey. At least 3 days on foot. Longer if the weather turns." "I know." "And you'll be traveling alone?" Elara nodded again. "I have still too." Mira was quiet, her thumb brushing lightly over Elara's knuckles. Then she spoke, her voice careful. "Is there something else? Something you're not telling me?" Elara's throat tightened. She had planned to keep the pregnancy a secret, to carry it alone until she was safely away. But sitting here with Mira, feeling the weight of her friend's kindness and concern, she realized she could not lie. Not to her. She drew a breath and spoke the truth. "I'm pregnant." Mira's hand tightened around hers, but her expression did not change. She simply waited, letting the words settle between them. "It's his?" Mira asked quietly. "Yes." Mira closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Does he know?" "No. And he won't. Not until I'm gone." Mira leaned forward slightly, her voice urgent but not unkind. "Elara, if he finds out before you leave?" "He won't," Elara interrupted. "No one knows except you." Mira studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. What do you need?" Relief washed over Elara, warm and unexpected. She had not realized how much she had feared this moment, how much she had feared Mira might try to talk her out of it, or worse, tell her she was wrong to go. "I need supplies," Elara said. "Food that will keep, a healer's kit, warmer clothes, and I need to know the safest route through the northern ridge." Mira nodded. "I can get all of that. It'll take a few days to gather everything without raising suspicion." "Thank you," Elara whispered. Mira squeezed her hand again. "You don't have to thank me. You're my friend. I'll help you however I can." They sat together in the quiet clearing, the bond between them stronger for the truth that had been shared. Elara felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. She was not completely alone. Not yet. "There's something else," Elara said after a moment. "Something I found in my grandmother's journal." Mira tilted her head, listening. Elara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But Mira had already proven her loyalty. She deserved to know. "My bloodline carries something," Elara said carefully. "A power that's been dormant for generations. My grandmother wrote about it. She said it would awaken when it was needed most." Mira's eyes widened slightly, but she did not interrupt. "The child I'm carrying," Elara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's connected to that power. My grandmother wrote that the bloodline would rise again through the next generation. That it could protect or destroy, depending on the heart that wielded it." Mira was silent for a long moment, her face thoughtful. Then she spoke, her tone measured. "Does your great-aunt know about this?" "I think so. My grandmother trusted her. If anyone can help me understand what this means, it's her." Mira nodded slowly. "Then you're right to go to her. But you need to be careful. If this power is real, others will want it. Or fear it." Elara knew that already. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest. "I'll be careful," she promised. Mira released her hand and stood, brushing the moss from her skirt. "We should go back before someone notices we're both gone. Meet me here tomorrow at the same time. I'll have everything ready." Elara rose and embraced her friend, holding on tightly for a moment before letting go. "Thank you," she said again. Mira smiled, though her eyes were sad. "Just promise me you'll be safe. And when you're settled, send word. Let me know you're all right." "I will." They walked back through the trees together, their footsteps soft on the damp earth. When they reached the garden gate, Mira paused and looked at her. "You're stronger than you know," she said quietly. "Don't forget that." Elara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She watched Mira slip back into the garden and disappear among the rows of herbs. Then she turned and made her way back toward the servants' quarters, her mind already racing ahead to the days that would follow, the supplies she would need to carry, the path she would take, the life she would begin once she reached the mountains. She did not see the figure standing in the shadow of the stone wall near the garden gate, did not hear the soft footsteps that retreated quickly toward the pack house. But someone had been there. Someone had heard enough. And by nightfall, the rumor would reach the ears of those who would act on it. Elara walked on, unaware, her thoughts focused only on the future she was building in her mind. A future that felt, for the first time in weeks, like something she could hold on to. Something real. Something hers. Elara was folding a worn linen shift when the door to the servants' quarters opened without warning. She looked up, startled, and found Kale standing in the doorway. His presence filled the small room instantly. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight, and there was something in his posture that spoke of barely controlled restraint. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with deliberate care. She straightened slowly, the shift still clutched in her hands. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face composed. She would not show him fear. "Not now, Elara," he said quietly. His voice was rough, strained. "We need to talk." She set the linen down on the narrow bed and folded her arms across her chest. "I have nothing to say to you." "Maybe not, but I have questions, and you're going to answer them." There was no command in his tone, only a raw kind of desperation that caught her off guard. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What do you want, Kale?" He took a step closer, then stopped, as though forcing himself to keep the distance. "I heard you're planning to leave." Her stomach dropped, but she didn't let it show. She met his gaze steadily. "And if I am? Why?" The question hung between them, simple and impossible. She wanted to laugh, to scream, but she did neither. She only looked at him, letting the silence stretch until it ached. "You really have to ask," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but beneath it lay a deep well of pain. "You made your choice, Kale. You crowned another woman. You let her humiliate me in front of the entire pack. You stood there and watched." His jaw clenched. "It wasn't that simple." "Then explain it to me." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might. But then he shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "I can't. Not yet." "Then we have nothing to talk about." She turned away, reaching for the satchel she'd left on the floor. Her hands were steady as she tucked the folded shift inside, though her heart was anything but. She could feel his eyes on her, burning into her back. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Somewhere I can breathe." "Elara." She turned to face him again, and this time she let him see the hurt she'd been holding back. Let him see everything she'd kept locked away since the day he'd placed that crown on Seraphine's head. "You broke me," she said softly. "You made me believe I mattered, that we mattered. And then you threw it away like it meant nothing." His expression twisted, something raw and broken surfacing in his eyes. "It wasn't nothing. Then why?" Her voice cracked, just slightly. "Why did you choose her?" He opened his mouth, but no answer came. He looked lost, shattered, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw the man she'd once loved beneath the cold mask he'd been wearing. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "I loved you," she continued, her voice steady again. "I gave you everything I had, and you took it and left me with nothing. That's not true, isn't it?" She took a breath, steadying herself. "You want to know why I'm leaving? Because I can't stay here and watch you build a life with someone else. I can't serve her. I can't pretend that what we had didn't matter. I can't keep breaking myself apart just to survive in a place that doesn't want me." Kale flinched as though she'd struck him. He took another step forward, and this time he didn't stop. He came close enough that she could see the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly. "But you did." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was something haunted in his gaze. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But don't leave. Not like this." "Why not?" "Because," he hesitated, searching for words. "Because I need to know you're safe." She laughed bitterly. "Safe? I haven't been safe here in weeks. Not since the moment you turned your back on me. Elara, please." The word was so quiet, so full of desperation, that it almost undid her. Almost. But she'd learned to protect herself now. She'd learned that love wasn't enough when it came without honesty, without trust. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said gently. "I'm not asking for anything from you anymore. I'm just letting go." He stared at her, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "I made a mistake." "Yes, you did. I can fix it." She shook her head slowly. "No, you can't. Not by holding me here. Not by making promises you can't keep." "Then what do you want from me?" His voice broke on the last word, and she saw the cracks in him widen. Saw the man she'd once known struggling beneath the weight of choices he couldn't undo. "I want you to let me go," she said softly. "I want you to stop pretending you have the right to decide what I do. You gave that up when you made her your Luna." His hands curled into fists at his sides. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, trembling with something that might have been rage or grief, or both. And then, finally, he nodded. Just once. A sharp, broken movement. "All right," he said hoarsely. "If that's what you need, I won't stop you." She felt the words settle over her like a blanket. Heavy. Final. She'd expected relief, but instead there was only a deep, aching sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. He turned toward the door, his movement stiff and mechanical. But before he reached it, he paused and looked back at her one last time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For all of it." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because if she spoke now, she would break. And she needed to hold herself together just a little longer. Cale opened the door and stepped through it, disappearing into the shadowed corridor beyond. The door closed softly behind him, and Elara was alone again. She sank down onto the bed, her legs suddenly weak. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her face, breathing slowly through the storm of emotions rising in her chest. He'd looked so lost, so broken. But she couldn't carry his pain anymore. She had her own to bear now, and a life to protect. She reached down and rested her hand gently over her stomach, where the small spark of life within her pulsed faintly, warm and steady. "It's going to be all right," she whispered. "We're going to be all right." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters softly. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a mournful sound that echoed across the dark hills. Elara closed her eyes and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. The grief, the anger, the love that still lingered despite everything. And then, slowly, she let it go. Tomorrow, she would leave. Tomorrow, she would begin again. But tonight, she allowed herself one last moment of mourning for the man she'd loved and the life she'd lost. One last moment before she stepped into the unknown. The new moon hung invisible in the sky when Elara finally crossed the border into neutral territory. Her legs ached from hours of walking through uneven terrain, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she climbed the rocky path toward the mountains. The forest had given way to sparse pines and bare stone, and the air grew thinner with each step. She'd left everything behind. Her few belongings fit into a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Mira had helped her gather supplies in secret. Dried meat, a water skin, a thick wool blanket. They'd embraced at the edge of the packlands, both of them crying, knowing it might be years before they saw each other again, if ever. Elara pushed the thought away and focused on placing one foot in front of the other. The path her grandmother's journal had described was still visible, despite the years of neglect. Markers carved into the stone, subtle symbols only someone from her bloodline would recognize. She followed them upward as the night deepened around her. The cabin appeared just as dawn began to break over the eastern ridge. It was small and weathered, built from dark timber and river stone, nestled into the mountainside as if it had grown there naturally. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. Someone was home. Elara's heart beat faster as she approached the door. She'd never met her great-aunt Liana. Her grandmother had spoken of her sister only rarely, and always with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. A healer, a seer, a woman who'd chosen solitude over the suffocating traditions of the pack. Elara raised her hand to knock, but the door opened before her knuckles touched the wood. The woman standing in the doorway was tall and lean, with silver hair braided down her back, and eyes the same deep brown as Elara's own. She wore simple clothing, a long tunic and trousers, both well-worn but clean. Her face was lined with age, but her gaze was sharp and clear. She looked at Elara for a long moment without speaking. Then she stepped aside and gestured into the warmth of the cabin. "Come in, child," she said quietly. "I've been expecting you." Elara's throat tightened. She stepped across the threshold, and the door closed softly behind her. The interior of the cabin was modest but welcoming. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering light across wooden shelves lined with jars of herbs and dried flowers. A small table sat near the window, 2 chairs drawn up to it. The scent of brewing tea filled the air, something earthy and calming. Liana moved to the hearth and poured steaming water into 2 clay cups. She handed one to Elara without a word, then gestured toward the table. Elara sat, cradling the warmth between her palms. Her hands were still trembling. Liana settled into the chair across from her and studied her face with quiet intensity. "You carry more than grief," she said after a moment. "You carry life." Elara's breath caught. She hadn't said anything, hadn't even mentioned why she'd come. "How did you—" "I can see it," Liana said simply. "The light inside you, the awakening." She leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "You don't know what it means yet, do you?" Elara shook her head slowly. Her hand drifted down to rest over her stomach. "I found my grandmother's journal," she said quietly. "She wrote about a prophecy, about our bloodline. But I don't understand that. I don't understand what's happening to me." Liana took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze never leaving Elara's face. "Our bloodline is old," she said. "Older than the pack structures. Older than the territories we fight over now. We were healers once, seers. Women who walked between worlds and carried the wisdom of the earth itself." She paused, her voice dropping lower. "That power has been dormant for generations, hidden. But it wakes when the blood is strong, and when a child is conceived in love, even if that love has been broken." Elara's chest tightened. She thought of Kael, of the night they'd spent together beneath the stars before everything fell apart. "The baby," she whispered. "The child you carry is the catalyst," Liana said gently. "The power is waking in you because of them. And when they are born, they will carry it too, stronger than it's been in centuries." She set her cup down and reached across the table, covering Elara's hand with her own. "That is why you are here. That is why you had to leave." "Because they would fear it," Elara said quietly. "Yes." Liana's fingers tightened slightly. "And because you need to learn to wield it before anyone realizes what you've become." The words settled over Elara like a heavy cloak. She felt the weight of them, but also something else, something that felt almost like hope. "Can you teach me?" she asked. Liana smiled faintly. It was a sad smile, but warm. "That's why I'm here, child." The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm Elara had never known. She woke before dawn each morning to the sound of Liana moving quietly through the cabin, preparing tea and tending the fire. They ate simple meals together: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and then Liana would lead her outside, into the cold mountain air, and the lessons would begin. At first, it was only breathing. Liana taught her to sit in stillness and draw air slowly into her lungs, feeling the way it moved through her body and settled into the space behind her ribs. She taught her to listen, not just with her ears, but with the deeper part of herself that had always been there, waiting. "The power is not something you force," Liana said one morning as they sat together on a flat stone overlooking the valley below. "It is something you allow, like water moving through a riverbed. You don't push it, you guide it." Elara closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. In, out, slow and steady. She felt the faint warmth in her chest begin to grow, a soft glow that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. "Good," Liana murmured. "Now, follow it. Let it move where it wants to go." Elara inhaled slowly and let her awareness sink deeper. The warmth spread through her limbs, gentle and steady, like sunlight seeping into cold earth. She felt the life inside her, small but strong, pulsing with the same rhythm. And then she felt something else, a presence, distant but unmistakable. Her breath hitched, and the warmth flickered. "Don't pull away," Liana said softly. "Stay with it." Elara forced herself to relax, to breathe, to listen. The presence grew clearer, familiar, achingly familiar. Kale. She felt him like a shadow at the edge of her awareness, far away, but moving closer. Her eyes snapped open, and the warmth faded instantly. Liana was watching her with quiet understanding. "The bond," she said. "It hasn't broken completely." Alara's hands trembled as she pressed them to her knees. Her heart raced. "He's looking for me," she whispered. Liana nodded slowly. "He will find you," she said calmly. "The question is, what will you do when he does?" Elara didn't answer. She couldn't. Because she didn't know. That night, she lay awake in the small bedroom Liana had given her, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the wind howl outside. The fire in the next room had burned low, and the cold crept through the cracks in the walls. She rested her hand over her stomach and felt the faint flutter of movement, so small but there. "I won't let him hurt you," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise." But even as she said it, she felt the pull of the bond tugging at her heart. And she wondered if Kale was lying awake somewhere too, staring into the dark and thinking of her. Kale felt it the moment the bond shifted. He was alone in his study, staring at nothing, when the thread between them went thin. Fragile, like something vital had been severed. He sat forward sharply, his chest tightening. The bond had never been strong, not like it should have been, not like it could have been if he hadn't pushed her away. But it had always been there, a quiet hum beneath his ribs, a reminder that she existed somewhere, breathing, alive. Now it felt different, weaker, wrong. He pressed his hand to his chest and closed his eyes, reaching for it instinctively. The connection flickered like a candle in the wind, distant, fading. And then he felt something else, a second heartbeat. His eyes snapped open. It was faint, impossibly small, but unmistakable. A rhythm layered beneath Elara's own, steady and strong and new. His breath left him all at once. She was pregnant. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, knocking the chair back, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the desk. She was carrying his child. And she hadn't told him. He thought of the way she had looked at him during their last conversation. The pain in her eyes. The quiet resignation in her voice when she told him she was leaving. She had known. She had stood there carrying his child, and she hadn't said a word. Because she didn't trust him. Because he had given her every reason not to. The weight of it crushed him. He sank back into the chair and buried his face in his hands, the ache in his chest so sharp it felt like drowning. He had failed her. He had chosen duty over her. Chosen the pack. Chosen Seraphine. Seraphine, who had lied to him from the beginning. The so-called alliance she had promised never existed. He had discovered the truth 3 days ago, buried in correspondence she thought he would never see. There had been no neighboring pack, no threat of war, no political necessity, only her ambition. She had manipulated him, played on his fears, and he had let her. He had crowned her Luna because he thought it was the right thing to do, because he thought he was protecting the pack. But all he had done was destroy the one person who had ever mattered. Cale stood slowly, his jaw set. He couldn't undo what he had done. But he could find her. He could tell her the truth. He could beg for forgiveness, even if he didn't deserve it, even if she never spoke to him again. He left that night without telling anyone. No guards, no ceremony, just him and the pull of the bond, faint but still there, leading him north toward the mountains. The journey took 3 days. He traveled through dense forest and across rocky terrain, following the thread between them like a lifeline. The bond grew stronger the closer he came, and with it, the second heartbeat, small and steady and impossibly precious. His child. The thought made his chest tighten every time. He didn't deserve this. He knew that. But he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. On the 3rd evening, as the sun dipped low behind the peaks, he reached the edge of a clearing. A small cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, steady line. He stopped at the tree line, his heart pounding. She was inside. He could feel her now, clear and unmistakable. The bond thrummed beneath his ribs, stronger than it had been in weeks. He hesitated, his hands curling into fists at his sides. What would he even say? How could he explain what he had done? He took a slow breath and stepped forward. The door to the cabin opened before he reached it. An older woman stood in the doorway, her silver hair braided over one shoulder, her gaze sharp and assessing. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're the Alpha," she said quietly. Cale stopped a few paces away. He inclined his head. "I am." The woman studied him in silence. Then she stepped aside, her voice calm but firm. "She's out back, by the water." Cale nodded and moved past her, his pulse racing. He followed a narrow path around the cabin and found Elara sitting on a smooth stone beside a small stream. Her back was to him, her hair loose around her shoulders, her hands resting gently on her knees. She was glowing, literally. A soft, golden light surrounded her, faint but unmistakable. It pulsed gently, in time with her breathing, like the warmth of sunrise breaking through mist. Cale stopped in his tracks, staring. She looked powerful, peaceful, beautiful in a way that stole the air from his lungs. Elara must have sensed him, because she went still. The glow faded slowly, sinking back into her skin like light retreating into water. She turned her head slightly, but didn't look at him. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was no warmth in it. Cale's throat tightened. He took a cautious step forward. "Elara," she stood slowly, turning to face him at last. Her hand rested protectively over her stomach, just barely rounded now, visible only if you knew to look. His gaze dropped to it, and the breath left him. "It's yours," she said quietly. "In case you were wondering." Cale shook his head quickly. "I wasn't. I know it is. I felt it. Through the bond." Her expression didn't change. She just watched him, her eyes guarded. He took another step closer, his hands open at his sides. "Elara, His voice cracked. He stopped, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She said nothing. He forced himself to keep going. "Seraphine lied to me. There was no alliance, no threat. She manipulated everything, and I believed her. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the pack." He looked down, his jaw tight. "But all I did was hurt you." Elara's expression softened just slightly, but her arms stayed folded across her chest. "Why are you here, Cale?" He looked up at her, his eyes full of pain. "Because I can't leave you out here alone. Because you're carrying our child. And I need to be here. I need to protect you. Both of you." She shook her head slowly. "I don't need your protection." "I know," he said quietly. "I can see that. I saw you just now. You're stronger than I ever realized." He stepped closer, his voice low and raw. "But I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't expect that. I need you to know the truth. And I need to be here. Even if it's only from a distance. Even if you never speak to me again." Elara's eyes shimmered, but she didn't let the tears fall. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked away, her hand still resting gently over her stomach. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered. "I know," Cale said, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it back." The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Finally, Elara nodded once. "You can stay," she said quietly, "but not in the cabin, and not because I've forgiven you." Cale's chest ached, but he nodded. "Thank you." She turned away, her shoulders tense, and walked slowly back toward the cabin. Cale stood by the stream, watching her go, his heart breaking and mending all at once. He had found her. Now he just had to prove he was worthy of staying. Cale stayed true to his word. He didn't push. He didn't ask for more than she'd given. He made camp by the stream, just beyond the clearing where the cabin stood, far enough to give her space, close enough to reach her if she called. Elara watched him from the window that first evening, her hand resting lightly on her stomach. She saw him gather stones for a fire circle, saw him lay out his bedroll beneath the trees. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a man trying not to frighten something fragile. She turned away before he could look up and catch her staring. Liana didn't comment on Cale's presence, but her knowing gaze said enough. She set an extra bowl of stew aside that night and left it on the porch step without a word. When Elara came out later, the bowl was gone. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Elara continued her training with Liana, learning to draw the power from deep within herself without letting it consume her. The light came easier now, softer and more controlled. It no longer frightened her. Cale kept his distance, but she felt him there. Always there. A steady presence at the edge of her awareness, like a shadow that refused to leave. Sometimes she caught glimpses of him chopping wood or mending the stone path that led down to the stream. Once, she saw him sitting on a flat rock by the water, his head bowed, his shoulders heavy with something she couldn't name. She told herself she didn't care, that his regret didn't matter, but her chest tightened every time she saw him, and she hated that it did. One morning, Liana handed her a basket and nodded toward the forest. "There's wild mint growing near the eastern ridge. Bring back enough for tea." Elara took the basket without question. The walk would do her good. The air was cool and clean, and the trees whispered gently overhead as she moved through them. She found the mint easily, its sharp scent filling the air. She knelt carefully, mindful of her growing belly, and began gathering the soft green leaves. She didn't hear him approach until his voice broke the silence. "Let me help." Elara turned, startled. Kale stood a few paces away, his hands at his sides, his expression cautious. She hesitated, then nodded once. He knelt across from her, keeping space between them, and began picking the mint with careful fingers. They worked in silence for a while. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. Finally, Kale spoke. His voice was quiet. "How are you feeling?" Elara didn't look up. "Fine." "And the baby?" "Strong." He nodded slowly, his eyes on the plants in his hands. "That's good." Another stretch of silence. Elara's chest felt tight. She didn't know why she said it, but the words came anyway. "I felt them kick yesterday." Kale's hands stilled. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and full of something fragile. "You did?" She nodded. "Just once. It was small, but real." His throat worked as he swallowed. I wish I could have been there." "You weren't," she said simply. "Not cruel, just honest." He looked down again, his jaw tight. "I know." Elara placed another handful of mint in the basket. "You can't undo what happened, Kale, no matter how long you stay out here." "I know that too." She finally met his eyes. "Then why are you still here?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was raw. "Because I can't leave you. Even if you never forgive me. Even if you send me away 100 times. I'll keep coming back." Her heart twisted painfully. She wanted to be angry, wanted to tell him it was too late. But all she felt was tired. "I loved you," she said quietly, "and you chose someone else." Kale's face crumpled. "I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Regret doesn't fix anything." "I know." He leaned forward slightly, his voice breaking. "But I need you to know. It was never about her. It was never about wanting someone else. I thought I was protecting the pack. I thought I had no choice." He shook his head. "I was wrong, and I was a coward, and I hurt the only person who ever really mattered." Elara's eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears fall. "You broke my heart." "I know. You made me feel like I wasn't enough." His breath hitched. "You were always enough. You were everything." She looked away, her hands trembling as she gathered more mint. "I don't know if I can believe that." "Then let me show you." His voice was barely a whisper. "Let me prove it. Every day. For as long as it takes." Elara closed her eyes. She wanted to say no, wanted to protect herself from more pain, but a part of her, small and stubborn, still remembered the way he used to look at her, the way he used to hold her like she was something precious. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. "I'm not ready to forgive you. I'm not asking you to. And I don't know if I ever will be." He nodded slowly. "I understand." She took a shaky breath. "But you can stay, for now." Relief flooded his face, so raw and unguarded that it made her chest ache. "Thank you," he whispered. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. Kale rose too, holding the basket out to her. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact sent a shiver through her, and she pulled back quickly. They walked back toward the cabin in silence, the space between them heavy with all the things neither of them could say yet. When they reached the clearing, Liana was waiting on the porch, her sharp eyes watching them both. She said nothing, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Elara climbed the steps and handed her the basket. Liana took it, then glanced past her toward Kale. "There's stew on the fire, enough for 3. Elara opened her mouth to protest, but Liana had already turned and gone inside. She looked back at Kale. He stood at the edge of the clearing, waiting. Uncertain. She hesitated, then nodded once. "You can eat with us, just this once." Kale's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you." That night, they sat around the table in Liana's small cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The stew was warm and rich, and for the first time in weeks, Elara felt something close to peace. Kale didn't speak much. He just watched her quietly, his eyes full of gratitude and something deeper. Something she wasn't ready to name yet. When the meal was finished, he stood and bowed his head respectfully to Liana. "Thank you for your hospitality." Liana waved him off. "Don't make me regret it." He smiled faintly, then looked at Elara. "Good night," she nodded. "Good night." He left quietly, and she watched through the window as he walked back toward his camp by the stream. His silhouette disappeared into the trees, and she felt the bond between them hum softly in her chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a thread, fragile and thin, but real. Liana came to stand beside her. "He loves you, you know." Elara didn't answer. "The question is," Liana said softly, "can you learn to trust him again?" Elara placed her hand over her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of life within. "I don't know," she whispered. Liana squeezed her shoulder gently. "You will, when you're ready." Elara nodded slowly, her eyes still on the darkening forest. Maybe one day, maybe not. But for now, she would take it one quiet step at a time.